Hello again. So today we're going to talk about secular music in the Renaissance, and I'm working from pages 88 on in the Camian text, basically to the end of this unit, over to page 94. By the way, in pages 95 and 96, there's a very helpful summary of stuff from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But back at page 88, where we begin this discussion of secular music in the Renaissance, a couple of things that I've already said, the book has already said, but it's worth reviewing. It says, during the Renaissance, secular music became increasingly popular. Throughout Europe, music was set to poems in various languages, including Italian, French, Spanish, German, Dutch, and English. All what we would call vernacular languages. So secular vocal music will be in vernacular languages. Sacred vocal music, that is within the Catholic Church certainly, is still going to be in Latin. So notice how they say here, music was set to poems in various languages. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. All of this music was poetry set to music. All of this secular vocal music that we're going to look at, which means that the guy who wrote the notes was usually not the guy who wrote the words. A poet would write a poem, and then a composer would set that poem to music. And that's almost always how it's done in classical, quote-unquote, vocal music. When we go through various eras to come, through the Baroque era, the classical era, the Romantic era, and we look at songs that have been written by other classical songwriters, or let's say operas, when we get into the Baroque era and the invention of opera, a very key thing that happens right at the beginning of the Baroque. The composers don't write the words, the text. They only write the music, almost without exception. Okay, here's another thing that has been stated before. The development of music printing helped spread secular music, and thousands of song collections became available. Music was an important leisure activity. Every educated person was expected to play an instrument and read notation, be able to read music. Already made that point before. Okay, so the most important genre of secular music in the Renaissance was the Madrigal, which begins in Italy around 1520 and then later becomes popular in England after 1588. And I'll explain the significance of 1588 in a moment, but so there are two different types of madrigal. The Italian madrigal, which comes first, and the English madrigal, which comes later. And these madrigals are basically just love poems set to music. And they are to be performed by usually between 4 and 7 singers, and each singer has their own individual part. So it's not like other types of choral music where you might have a bunch of people singing the same part, like, I don't know, 10 altos, 10 sopranos, 10 tenors, and 10 basses, like in a large choir. Madrigals were originally meant to be sung one singer to each part. And they might be sung just by men, just by women, or by mixed groups of men and women. And they were often sung at sort of social occasions, parties. It was normal in those days, people get together for some kind of a party or a dinner, that they might pass around a madrigal and start to sing. So they mention a couple of the Italian madrigal composers, Luca Marenzio and Carlo Gesualdo. Carlo Gesualdo is kind of an infamous reputation among composers because he had his wife and her lover murdered. He discovered that she was cheating on him and told his wife, I'm going to go away for a few days for a hunting trip. Bye-bye, have a nice time. And while he was away, his wife's lover apparently came to visit, and he had them dealt with. And he also wrote a lot of very, sometimes very strange and gloomy sounding madrigals with often this very unusual chromatic harmony. It sounds sort of like barbershop quartet. The example of a madrigal that we have in the book for you guys is not an Italian madrigal, however, it's an English madrigal. The madrigal became popular in England, specifically in the year 1588, or after 1588, because in that year, a book of translated Italian madrigal texts, that is translated from Italian into English, became a bestseller in England. And this is what started this madrigal craze in England. This book is called Musica Transalpina, Music from Across the Alps. Of course, if you're sort of familiar with European geography, for any place else in Europe, if you want to get to Italy over land, you have to cross the Alps. The Alps are this mountain range that sort of separates the Italian peninsula from the rest of the European mainland. Of course, during this time, what's going on in 1588, thereabouts, in England? This is the Elizabethan Renaissance. This is a great period of cultural activity, especially in literature. This is a time of William Shakespeare, and also in music. A lot of great English composers around this time. So it's a great time to be a poet or a musician in England. In particular because the Queen herself, Queen Elizabeth, was a great patron of the arts and was very much favored by poets and composers. And the piece that we're going to listen to is actually composed as a sort of an homage to Queen Elizabeth herself. Toward the end of her reign, in the year 1601, a bunch of English composers got together and said, here's an idea, why don't we make a book, an anthology of madrigals, all about, dedicated to Elizabeth and all about how wonderful she is. And we'll put it together and publish it, and wouldn't that be a nice thing to do for the Queen? So this is what they did. So this collection is called the Triumphs of Orianna. Orianna is a sort of a pet name, a code name for Elizabeth herself. And this madrigal by Thomas Weelkes, As Vesta Was Descending, is from that anthology. Now, the imagery in this madrigal is potentially kind of confusing, but the main thing is that the text is sort of, first of all, making references to Greek or Roman myth, or figures or scenes from Greek and Roman myth. This is, of course, an aspect of Renaissance era humanism, right? This is the humanists of the Renaissance were all into the Greek and Roman stuff, right? So it sort of ties together something that we learned about before in the lecture on the cultural background of the Renaissance. And basically, the whoever wrote the words to this madrigal is making the point that Elizabeth is so wonderful, she's even greater than a Roman goddess, right? Here's the text. As Vesta was from Latmos hill descending, Vesta being the Roman goddess of the hearth, very, very important goddess in the Roman pantheon. If you've ever heard of the Vestal Virgins or the Temple of Vesta, very, very important sacred place in ancient Rome. The Vestal Virgins were the priestesses of the Temple of Vesta, who had to keep this this flame going, this perpetual flame in the hearth of the Temple of Vesta. Vesta is the goddess of the hearth, the goddess of the home and hearth, among other things. So the Roman goddess Vesta is descending Latmos Hill, and she spies a maiden queen, Elizabeth, obviously, right? The same hill ascending. So Vesta's going down the hill, and she sees a maiden queen, obviously Elizabeth, going up the hill, attended on by all the shepherd swain, to whom Diana's darlings came running down amain. First 2 by 2, then 3 by 3. Who are Diana's darlings and the shepherd swain? Well, they're sort of like the entourage of Vesta and of Elizabeth. And the point is, all of the followers of Vesta, the entourage, Diana's darlings as they're called, abandon Vesta, run away from her, and instead flock down the hill to join Elizabeth, who is coming up the other way, right? Because Elizabeth is so wonderful, she's even better than a Roman goddess. First 2 by 2, then 3 by 3, together, leaving their goddess all alone, hasted thither, meaning went down there quickly, and mingling with the shepherds of her train, with mirthful tunes her presence entertain. Then sang the shepherds and nymphs of Diana, long live fair Orianna. And the last about minute or so of this song is just the words, long live fair Orianna, over and over and over again. Now, in this text, there are lots and lots of opportunities for what we call text painting or word painting, that Wilkes takes every advantage possible to, or every opportunity to try and depict the meanings of the words. So, for example, and these are all described on the listening guide in the left-hand column. On the word descending, as Vesta was from Latmos Hill descending. On the words descending, we hear descending scale patterns. And on the word ascending, she spied a maiden queen, the same ascending. We hear ascending patterns of scales. Attended on by all the shepherd swain, to whom Diana's darlings came running down amain. And on the word running down, again, a sort of descending, running scale pattern. On the words first 2 by 2, we have a duet, 2 people singing. And then on the words 3 by 3, 3 people singing. On the words all alone, 1 person singing. And this very sad little melody, all alone. So, lots of examples of text painting here, and it's done in a very obvious way. This is sometimes you find in secular music, the text painting is very obvious and it's sort of witty and clever, whereas in sacred music it might be much more subtle and not as obvious and not meant to be too in your face. Right? Okay, then the other example of a secular work from the Renaissance is also English, it turns out, and it's a lute song. So let me talk a little bit about the lute. You can see a picture of a lute over here on page 93. It looks very similar to a guitar, right? It's played the same way. It does have a different shape. It's got a rounded back instead of a flat back. It generally has more strings, but a shorter neck and fewer frets. But this was sort of like the Renaissance equivalent of the guitar. You know, the guitar is maybe the most popular instrument today. Unlike most keyboard instruments, it has the advantage of being very portable. You can take it out into the country and sit down and play. while your friend and his boyfriend dance. Notice how she doesn't look really happy. She's like, I'm stuck here playing the lute while those two dance. But, so the lute, very, very popular instrument, and lots of pieces were written just for the lute itself, but also for lute and singer. And the person playing the lute might also sing, or maybe the person playing the lute is accompanying a singer. Probably the greatest of these lute players back in the day was a man named John Dowland, who lived from 1563 to 1626. And this song that we're going to listen to, probably his best-known work, certainly his best-known work, and really maybe the most popular song in the English language for over 100 years after his death, is this song, Flow My Tears. And as they mentioned, this song has been recorded many, many times, even by Sting. Heard of Sting, the lead singer of The Police, very popular band back when I was your age. Sting has recorded some of these lute songs by John Dowland. The way he sings them is his own way. He doesn't sound like a classical singer, but it might be interesting to check them out. Maybe I'll find the link to Sting's performance of this song and put it up on my YouTube channel. The recording that we have is a more traditional, by a classically trained singer who is a countertenor, by the way, who is singing, who has a voice range that is an octave higher than a normal tenor, and who is singing in what we call head voice, but what you might know as falsetto. Right? So this song apparently started out as a purely instrumental song for the lute, without words, but Dowland added words to it later. But interestingly, he fit the words to the music. And there are examples of text painting here that are, the most obvious is the downward motive, which the book points out, on the words, flow my tears, fall from your springs. I'm not a countertenor, I'm not a trained singer, but the downward shape of that main motive, that structure that makes up the phrases, could be, with a little imagination, you can imagine sort of tears flowing down. Flow my tears, fall from your springs. It's a falling motion that makes you think maybe of tears running down someone's face. And the words themselves, which may well have been written, I'm not even sure about this, by Dowland himself. Right? The book doesn't make it clear, I believe, whether he wrote the words himself. I haven't thought of that because I just made the point that usually these composers did not write the words, but this may be an exception. I'm going to find that out just for my own edification. It's not something I would ask on the test since I don't even know myself. But the words themselves are, I think, a really excellent poem. So I'm going to read through it a little bit here. Flow my tears, fall from your springs. Exiled forever, let me mourn. Where night's black bird her sad infamy sings. There let me live forlorn. Down, vain lights, shine you no more. No nights are dark enough for those that in despair their lost fortunes deplore. Light doth but shame disclose. In other words, this person is so sad, and this was part of John Dowland's persona. He had this image of being someone who's sort of a sad sack, and his songs tended to be very sad and gloomy, sort of like emo. I guess I don't know much about emo, but I heard there's this musical style called emo that's sort of like this. It's like sad and gloomy and mopey and woe is me. That was John Dowland's persona. I don't know if he was really that way in person, but that was the sort of persona that he cultivated as a singer, as a musician. So I'm not going to read the whole, but this is a great little stanza right here that from the highest spire of contentment my fortune is thrown, and fear and grief and pain for my deserts are my hopes, since hope is gone. The highest spire of contentment, like I was way up here, I was on the highest spire of contentment, but my fortune is thrown. Hark you shadows that in darkness dwell, learn to condemn light. Happy, happy they that in hell feel not the world's despite. So again, pretty dark there. Saying those who are in hell are happier than us here on earth because they don't feel the world's despite, the spite or the pain or the anguish of life here on earth. Hell would be preferable to what I'm going through. Okay, so they point out the structure, by the way, of this song. It basically has three different sections. That is, the same music. The music changes three times, but each of those sections is repeated. So it's like A, B, B, C, C. Now the words change each different verse, except the last two. The last two verses have the same melody and the same words. All right, and then the final example, instrumental music, is, now this is an example that they talk about, but that is not in your listening for some reason. Now I put a link to it up on the YouTube channel, but it is not one that I believe is included in the book, so it's not going to be one that's on your listening list, but listen to it anyway. It's an example of purely instrumental dance music from the Renaissance. So we had instrumental music for dancing to back in the Middle Ages as well, right? So remember the estampie, which is in your listening, is one of your assigned listening. That was a popular dance in late medieval France. As we get into the Renaissance, dancing, like other leisure activities, other secular activities, that, things of this world are, people take more of an interest in them, and they're seen as important enough that this music was actually written down and preserved and put into collections. Right? So we start to see more instrumental music in the Renaissance. Now, we still don't see as much as we are going to see later on. In the next unit, when we get to the Baroque era, that's when instrumental music really takes off and comes into its own. Right? So for now, there's more of it, certainly than there was available during the Middle Ages. There's more of it, but really the golden age of instrumental music is still yet to come, and we'll get to it in the next unit. A lot of the Renaissance instrumental music tended to be arrangements of pieces that were written for the voice. So vocal music is really still dominant. And if you were an instrumentalist, probably a lot of what you would be playing were arrangements for instruments of pieces that were originally written for voice. But there is some original instrumental music, and most of that is music for dancing to. And what was usually done in those days is that instrumental dance music was composed and sort of presented in pairs. There would be a slower dance followed by a faster one. And the dance pairs might have similar melodies, similar themes in them, and they would be in the same key, so that they sounded like they belonged together, but they would be obviously have different tempos and different meters, which would correspond to the different steps of the specific dance. Remember, in those days, for a very long time, like up until fairly recently, dances had very specific steps that you had to learn, and you danced in groups in a coordinated way. You didn't just kind of move around in a funky way, doing your own thing on the dance floor. You had to dance, you had to learn specific steps, and it was very important, actually, to for your sort of social status, to be a good dancer and to be skillful and graceful and not step on people's feet. Because if you weren't a good dancer, you wouldn't get invited to those kind of things, right? And your social status would be affected as a result, especially for people in the, let's say, the upper middle class or the nobility, right? Remember how I said that in this time, sort of cultivating your social status meant being well educated, being witty, being literate, being able to read music, being able to sing, and also being able to dance. Okay, so dance pairs usually, again, included a slower dance and a faster dance in the same key. So a popular combination, for example, was the pavane, just slow dance, paired with the galliard, or the passamezzo, which literally means medium step, slow dance, paired with the faster saltarello. In this case, actually, what we have is a passamezzo, slow dance, paired with a galliard, which is the faster dance. And this is an example of a passamezzo and galliard by the French composer Pierre-Francisque Caroubel. Caroubel is the composer, but this piece was included in an anthology that is a collection of dance music that was published by a different composer and music publisher named Michael Praetorius. And Praetorius included this dance pair in an anthology that he had printed and gave the title Terpsichore. Terpsichore was the muse of dance, was an ancient Greek goddess, one of the 9 muses, the muse of dance, or like this, one of the daughters of Zeus, who has this kind of creative, inspirational power. If you've ever heard of someone being inspired by a muse, that's what the muses were. And again, a reference to Greek or Roman, classical myth. This kind of stuff is all over the place in the Renaissance. Remember, that's what's seen as being reborn. That's what gives the title Renaissance its name. So another little connection there. Okay, so the book points out, there is a little listening guide on page 94 to 95, and they point out the structure of this dance pair, and they compare the melody of the passamezzo with that of the galliard, and they are very similar. They might not necessarily sound similar because they're moving at different speeds, etc., but looking at the notes, they actually are similar. Okay, so I'm not going to listen to those during the lecture, but we've got links to them in the D2L and in the YouTube channel here. If you look for my saved videos, if you look at my playlists and click on Renaissance, you'll find these, and I'll also look for that recording of Flow My Tears by Sting and put it on there as well. And that'll pretty much wrap up this chapter. And since I'm coming in now at about 28 minutes, maybe I'll spend a few minutes talking about ways that you might prepare over the next, however long we've got by the time this video gets uploaded, over the next day, let's say, before your test this coming Wednesday. At least Wednesday if you're watching this in fall of 2020. One thing I would do, I think, since we have 2 different eras, and we have a lot of stuff happening at different times over a very long time span, right? Because remember, the dates of the Middle Ages, 450 to 1450, long time, and then the dates of the Renaissance, 1450 to 1600. We've got lots of things happening over these 2 eras, and one way of sort of organizing the material, bringing it all together, which I think is important to do. Remember, I've said, you don't want to just memorize definitions, individual little factoids, right? You want to take those, you do want to know definitions of terms and concepts, but you want to plug them in to a larger framework. It's like, again, individual jigsaw puzzles. You want to build a big picture out of them. You don't want to just memorize little individual jigsaw puzzles and keep them unconnected. You want to connect the material, find ways to connect as much as possible. So here's one way to do this. Make a timeline, right? So maybe one timeline for the Middle Ages and one for the Renaissance. And you might want to do this on a larger piece of paper than your usual, get one of those double-size pieces of paper somewhere and draw a line on it. And let's say for the Middle Ages, your starting point is going to be 1450, ending point is, 450 to 1450. And along that timeline, you're going to have various things that you can look up. Anything that there's a date, anything that they give you a date for in the book, stick it in the timeline, right? Now, I might not necessarily ask specific dates on things, but something I might. You don't know what I'm going to ask, what I'm not going to ask. But some of the things I'm going to ask will definitely involve dates. The point is not necessarily just to memorize the dates, it's to fit everything in together and have a big picture. So here's some of the things that could be on there. Just, again, moving in chronological order. 450, beginning of the Middle Ages, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is happening around that time. Right? Pope Gregory becomes Pope from 590 to 604. That's something you can put in there. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask a question about Pope Gregory, but I might. Gregorian Chants first start to be written down rather than just passed along orally around the 9th century. That would be the 800s. Right? Also around that same time, between 700 AD and 900 AD, this is when organum starts to develop. Ooh, what is organum again? Organum is Gregorian chant plus additional lines of melody. And the earliest, most primitive type of organum, parallel organum, has its origins somewhere in there, somewhere between 700 and 900. We're not even really sure exactly, but we believe someplace in there. Right? Okay, moving along, sticking with the subject of organum. Remember, I said organum continues to develop and evolve until we get into, let's say, the 1100s and the 1200s. This is the era of Notre Dame organum, right? The more advanced, complex type of organum where the Gregorian chant is in the lowest line and it's held out in long, sustained tones, and the melodies that are added are moving faster and moving in the rhythmic modes, right? So you notice how, as I'm putting together my timeline, I'm kind of forced to review the material as I'm plugging it in, and that's part of the idea. Let's see, what else is happening in the Middle Ages? Well, we have several composers. We have Hildegard of Bingen, among the earliest composers that we know by name. She was born around, I believe it's 1098, and lived until around 1180 or so. Right around that same time also, the composers Léonin and Perrotin. Léonin, his life is in we believe, the latter half of the 1100s, let's say 12th century, and Perrotin is a little bit later than that, like late 12th century, early 13th century. Also right around that time is the time of the Troubadours, right? The Troubadours, remember these sort of poet, composer, singer-songwriters, and they are flourishing in southern France, beginning around the late 11th century into the 12th and 13th centuries, later in northern France, where they're known as the Troubadours, and over in Germany, where they're known as the Minnesingers. Their time period is like the 12th and 13th century, beginning in the late 11th century, but we could say 11th, 12th, 13th century. Then we get into the Ars Nova period. That's the 14th century, and that's the time of Guillaume de Machaut, and also over in Italy, Francesco Landini, right? So you can put their their names and their contributions over there, especially Machaut. The book focuses more on Machaut. And then, since the 14th century is the period of the Ars Nova. Okay, well, what's different about music of the Ars Nova? Why is it called Ars Nova, which means new art? What is new and different about? And you would maybe include that in your timeline. New system of rhythmic notation develops, which allows composers to specify any rhythmic pattern. And this is a big advance over the earlier system used during the in the time of, let's say, Notre Dame organ. Remember where they had the rhythmic modes, repetitive patterns of long and short notes. So again, the idea is that make a timeline so that you can plug everything in and put it somewhere on that, in the correct place on that timeline, and sort of bring the material together so that you can sort of stand back at it, look at it in sort of the big picture, and also really to test whether you understand this stuff. Remember, what I test on is understanding. Merely remembering without understanding is not of much use. Okay, so the timeline is one way to bring the material together. Another way is to make an outline. Again, I'm looking for ways to bring the material together and organize it into some framework, rather than, let's say, making lots of index cards, which again splits the material apart, atomizes it into lots of little individual bits. This summary, actually, the last 2 pages of the unit, is an excellent kind of an outline. This is exactly the kind of thing that you should make on your own. And in a way, it's kind of too bad that the book does it for you, because the benefit of something like this is when you do it yourself. Now, there is value in the fact that the book does it for you. They're showing you how to do this kind of thing. Right? What I would do is to make something similar to this, but on your own. Go through the effort to do it yourself, to find the material, to decide, okay, how am I going to organize it? What am I going to include and what am I going to leave out? Because obviously you can't include absolutely everything. That would be just like rewriting the entire chapter, right? When you make an outline like this, the decision-making process, like, okay, which things are sort of like general and important enough that I'm going to include them, and which things are, let's say, specific enough or kind of like nitpicky that I might not want to include them, right? And then how am I going to organize this thing? The way the book does it is music in society, Middle Ages, right? I'm talking about how, the role of musicians, what societal class did musicians come from, all that kind of stuff. And then important style features of the Middle Ages. Performance practice. There's a little bit there. We don't know very much about performance practice in the Middle Ages. And then they do the same thing, music in society for the Renaissance and important style features of the Renaissance. Notice how I structured these lectures, by the way. I started off with talking about what the term Middle Ages means. First of all, what the dates are, and what's the significance of those dates, and what does the term Middle Ages mean? Why do we call it that? Right? And really, that's the first thing to know, literally. The first thing to know about the Middle Ages is when was it, and why is it called that? Once we've established that, we've got sort of like the frame of our picture and the title. The frame is, if we're talking about the Middle Ages, the frame of our picture is the brackets around the era itself, 450 to 1450. That's the frame. We understand the significance of those dates. And then the title of our picture is the Middle Ages. Okay, what does that title mean? What's it in the middle of? Knowing that helps you to understand something about the Middle Ages. It was given that term by people in the Renaissance who saw the Middle Ages as this kind of wasted, this sort of wasteland between the great and glorious classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. And then when Rome fell, and now we're in this Middle Age. And the revival of the spirit, of the values, of whatever, of the kind of outlook, and therefore the kind of art and literature and architecture and everything that we saw back in those great, glorious ancient cultures is now being revived, is undergoing a renaissance, right? Okay, so we've got our frame, we've got our title, we understand the title, and then we start putting stuff in the background of our picture. What's in the background of our, music in the Renaissance? Well, in the background is the society. Or same thing for the Middle Ages, let's say. I was talking about the Middle Ages. What's going on in the background of our big picture? Well, how is society structured? What are the different classes of society? What do each of those classes do? And therefore, and what is their relative power to each other? And then getting more specifically into music, which of these classes is most likely to be musically trained? Right? And how does this change over time? Because the Middle Ages is not all the same. Remember, the later on we go in the Middle Ages, when we get into the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, we see more secularism, and we see a rise in the power of the nobility, and therefore we see more non-clergy beginning to take an interest in music, learning how to write music, etc., right? So that's something, again, you could put that in your timeline as well. Maybe here's your timeline for the Middle Ages, and towards the end you have a little arrow that's going up and says increased secularism. Now you can write the words increased secularism because I told you to do that, but the key thing is that you understand what that means. What does the word secular mean? What does the word sacred mean, right? So we're tying all this information together and making sort of I know I'm using lots of different metaphors, right? A picture, but it's sort of like when you tie the information together, you make like a mesh, a net, and each fact is reinforced by its connection to other facts, and your grasp of the material is that much stronger. And any kind of like trick question that I throw at you is unlikely to make it through that net because you understand each fact from a variety of different perspectives. You can connect each fact to each other fact. So if I give you like a tricky question, and I don't go out of my way to write trick questions, by the way. I'm not trying to trick people up. I'm trying to see if you understand the material, right? But there will be times when you'll say, well, wait a minute, okay, if this answer is true, or if A is the best answer, that must mean that related fact over here, over here, over here must also be true or must be false, right? And if you're just memorizing individual facts and not the connections from this fact to that one, to this one, to that one, you can't test the validity of something like that. Oh, all I know is this one thing. I don't know how it connects to this or to that. Then you're at a loss, right? But if you understand the connections of one fact or one term or one concept or one composer, let's say, to various other things, if you maintain these and notice these connections and sort of maintain them in the way that you learn, in the way that you approach the material, then you are not going to be tripped up as easily. You are going to be able to check, you're going to be able to sort of cross-check and say, well, wait a minute, that can't be true because this other thing is true. Or this must be true because I know these 2 or 3 other things are true. You might know the answers. You might have memorized like the answers in advance, but the problem is you don't know what questions I'm going to ask. You don't know how I'm going to ask them, right? So, if you really want to be well prepared, try and bring these various facts together, especially as we are approaching now the test itself. And you've got a lot of information to carry in your heads. Again, it's 2 eras in music, 2 different eras, and a lot of unfamiliar information in there. So I would try and prepare in that way. Here's another, so I talked about making a timeline, making an outline. Another thing that you might do is to start comparing, since we got 2 different eras, comparing the Middle Ages with the Renaissance, like making lists of things that are true for the Middle Ages, but not the Renaissance. Things that are true for the Renaissance, but not the Middle Ages, and maybe things that they both have in common. There are some things that are common to both medieval and Renaissance music. So here's a big one. Most written down music, that is, like serious music by people who know how to write music, was vocal. In both eras, instrumental music is less important than vocal music. That's true for both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But there are a lot of other things that are not true for both, that are true for one and not the other. Right? So that's another way that you might approach preparing in this final day or two as a way of reviewing kind of everything and putting a big picture together, and also keeping the distinctions between these two different eras in your head. Another thing I can't stress enough is to start getting yourself away from your notes and testing to see whether the material is in your brain. All right. So, for example, even though this is an open book test, right? Open book, open notes. If you're taking this in fall of 2020, anyway. So you might use the book and like point to a term somewhere and say, see if you can come up with the definition of the term without reading it from your notes. Like, for example, I'm just looking at the word drone. What is a drone? We know what a drone is in modern times, one of those cool little helicopters with a camera on it that you can spy on people. They didn't have those in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but musically what a drone is, it's the simplest type of accompaniment, consisting of a single note, or sometimes a pair of notes, that are sustained or repeated over and over again. We heard a couple examples of drones in the chant by Hildegard. They added a drone accompaniment played by a stringed instrument, and it was just like a long, sustained single tone. In the Estampillé also, there was a drone of two notes that was played, that was repeated over and over again on this instrument called a psaltery, stringed instrument, sort of a very primitive kind of a harp. Even like bagpipes use a drone. When you hear someone playing bagpipes, the bag that they're squeezing on is pumping air through the drone pipes, and then the melody is what the bagpiper is blowing into on that, the pipe that has little finger holes on it. Right? Okay, so I just picked a term at random, drone, and I came up with the definition and I explained what a drone is out of my head. I didn't read it in the notes somewhere. Of course, I can do that because I'm a music professor and that's my job. But you should be able to do that too. And if you find that you can't explain something, if you find yourself saying, oh, I know this, anytime someone says, I know this, it means they don't know it. And they're saying something that they remember learning about it or something, but they don't really know it yet, because if they knew it, they would be telling you what it is, instead of saying, I know this. And so if you find yourself saying, I know this, that's a sign that you don't know something, and you should try and make yourself know it. And you should, certainly by now, you should be trying to wean yourself from your notes, from the book, and see if you've got it in your head. Now, yes, you have open notes, you have open book in this test, but you also have only 50 minutes, and might be better to not be furiously searching through your notes or your book in order to get the answers. Right? Okay, so that's, I'm up at about 50 minutes now, so all I'm going to say from here on out is good luck. Please feel free to email me with any questions you have, and we'll see you for the test on Wednesday. Bye-bye.